Pessoal, boa tarde a todos. Hoje eu estou aqui com um convidado bastante ilustre aqui no nosso canal também. Ele é o professor Howard Williams, da Universidade de Chester. Ele, inclusive, ele tem uma pesquisa muitíssimo interessante sobre um tema que também é novo aqui no canal, apesar da gente comentar um pouco sobre esse tema. Mas esse tema, a gente vai tratar dele com uma forma, assim, eu digo, até especial da gente falar, porque é um tema que muitas das vezes, como eu posso dizer, ele tem, assim, às vezes, uma certa polêmica, uma lida com como a gente lida, que é a questão justamente da morte, né, vamos dizer assim. E a gente vai estudar justamente alguma dessas práticas que tem no trabalho dele, questão de prática funerária, na era Viking, questão justamente do que ele trabalha com essa questão da lida na morte durante esse período. Ele também trabalha com a questão de alguns monumentos que estão relacionados também a esses achados arqueológicos, que tem esse movimento também com práticas funerárias. Então, eu vou passar aqui a palavra para ele e a gente vai ter essa conversa assim, bem interessante. Professor Howard, thank you so much for being here in the channel. It's a major pleasure receiving you here. You have a very interesting research about funerals, burials practices in the Viking Age in some areas of England that the Vikings occupied in some aspects. And before we start our interview, I would like to know, how do you start your interest for this topic and to research about the presence of the Viking Age in England and the funeral practices, the monuments related to that?
Yes, thank you, Marcia, for allowing me to join this conversation. I've long been interested in early medieval death rituals and funerary monuments, and I completed my doctoral research in the year 2000 at the University of Reading on 5th, 6th century, the pre-Viking Age, early Anglo-Saxon period cremation practices, and my thesis was about both a new analysis of the data of the burial rituals from the archaeological evidence, but also I looked at comparative ethnographic and historical sources to help us understand different pre-modern death rituals and understand in particular burning the dead. And that was a theme that I pursued for my doctoral research. And then when I became a lecturer and I started producing research that had a broader framework, I try to contribute to broader discussions on the Viking Age, on slightly later in period, and how we understand some of the variable different ways in which we have evidence of people disposing of their dead. And this was a really exciting time in the sort of the noughties of working on Viking period death rituals, because there was a lot of exciting new excavations, but also new ideas coming forward about how we interpret these practices. And so that work sort of developed in a number of different directions. And so I've as a lecturer, I've been a lecturer at 4 institutions. I've been a professor at the University of Chester since 2010. I've been teaching and researching on not just the Viking Age, but how we interpret sort of early historic death rituals and funerary monuments, looking at both the furnished burial practices and cremations, and also the carved stone monuments. But in my recent years, I've been also looking a lot at how we operate as public archaeologists, how we try to both share good information and challenge disinformation and misinformation about these areas, which have a broad interest globally, as this conversation illustrates. The fact that we're having this conversation shows the huge interest around the world in the Viking Age, because people are interested in history, but also people are interested in the spirituality and the heritage and the folklore. And there's lots of different ways in which people are interested in it. They're interested in Marvel comics and Marvel films and the TV shows and music. And there's lots of different ways in which people find themselves interested in the Vikings. So my sort of very academic study of death rituals fits into these broader global conversations we're having today about what was the Viking Age, who were the Vikings, and what does it mean to us today? So I guess that explains how I got started and how I'm trying to keep going with this kind of field of discussion, both in my teaching and my research, and also, but also as well in the public engagement. I've got my WordPress channel, Archaeodeath, and also on YouTube too, and on TikTok I have a channel where I discuss some of these issues about the Vikings and archaeological evidence for the early Middle Ages more broadly.
Oh, perfect. And is that I would start our conversation is about what is exactly the Viking Age, because I saw
Yes.
your article about the Viking Research Public, and it's interesting because you appointment that we need to have a complement each other, that the academic research with some things that are put to the public in some situation that I was, how can I explain, to the media. We
Yeah.
have the series, the TV shows, and what we are doing with the Viking Age. The Viking Age
Yeah.
was in a correct way. We need to have some aspects that we are forgetting to talk about that. How is this work?
Yeah, I mean, so there are some academics that have rejected the use of the term Viking Age and find it more harmful than helpful. Less, that it's to use that classic American term, it's problematic, and that we should stop using the term. I don't take that approach because it's really so much more than the term Vikings and the Viking Age really is a 19th century creation. But we're so used to it; it's used across the globe. People won't have heard of many other themes and periods and peoples from the early Middle Ages, but they will have heard of the Vikings. And so I think it would be a bit of a difficult thing if we abandoned it. And there's a more academic reason why we shouldn't abandon it, is that whether we like it or not, the Viking Age is now. We're living in the Viking Age because today is the time when we've never before had more interest and enthusiasm for this period. So academics saying now, oh, we shouldn't use this term, are missing the point that, you like it or not, the Viking Age is about our perception of the past, and you can't, unless you're living in some kind of sort of sensorial police state, we can't ban people from talking about a period that is and ideas that are widely popular across many different media. So my response to it is that yes, the term Vikings has perhaps only limited use from the period itself, and there's a whole debate about where the term comes from, as you'll know well about this, but the most likely source is it refers in some sense originally maybe to people from the coastline inlets, and it may refer to coastal raiders and traders. It's about sea voyaging, but by the time that the sources start being written down, that term is already becoming, evolving and adapting, and by the 19th century it's become part of this romantic nationalist Scandinavian sort of origin myth of where the nations come from, of particularly Denmark, but then Sweden and Norway, and then everyone around Europe starts claiming the Vikings as well. In Britain, the Vikings are the baddies, the enemy, or they're in some parts of northern England and Scotland, they are like ancestors too, places where Scandinavians did settle. So that term is with us now, and it's so popular. So we have to, when we're archaeologists and historians working in this 21st century conversation, we cannot say, oh, we can fact check the Vikings out of existence, that you shouldn't talk about the Vikings. We have to admit that the Vikings are not only in our imagined past, they're in our present. They're part of our broader cultural conversation, and some of that is politically extremist, some of it is deeply pernicious and hateful, but a lot of it is also fun and interesting and playful and engaging, and about all manner of other themes and tropes. So for me, I think archaeologists, I'm a Viking period archaeologist, I study the Viking Age, but I also have to talk about themes in our popular culture that derive from our source material.
Oh, that's a very interesting, because we can saw that have a linear point that we introduced this term Viking Age, but it's not used in that period. We
No.
can say that we call them Vikings, but
Yeah.
we don't know if they really call
Exactly.
them each other Vikings, and that's very interesting because, as you say, we are living the Viking Age in our periods since the 19th century, and this is a complement of each other to give us the research about the Viking Age. So, what you can say about this study? We can say that how we can have a term or some point that we will say to express what is exactly the Viking Age, not using this term but other
Yeah.
term.
Yeah. So I mean, every book on the Viking Age has the Vikings in their title, and then we'll have an immediate opening explaining that this term isn't helpful and trying to bracket what we mean. And what we tend to mean now, and different scholars will give you different characterizations, but the way I try to simplify it is to say that the Viking Age is a chronological and geographical descriptor. It's not perfect. It doesn't explain everything, but it captures a time in Northern Europe and areas connected to Northern Europe of an uptick in trading and raiding, and of a diaspora, a movement of Scandinavians out of Scandinavia, but also a movement of ideas and people into Scandinavia. So it's about a network. And I think thinking in modern scholarship, two ideas that come up in the last 20 years come to the fore is understanding the Viking Age. If we're going to use the term, we don't use it as an ethnic label. We don't use it as a religious framing. The Viking Age was a time of Christian conversion and an intermingling of different faiths and peoples. So using it in an ethnic or religious sense makes no sense. The only way we can really use it at all now in current scholarship is as a chronological descriptor for a geographical region to describe a complex set of processes of networks of trading and raiding, of military conquest and Scandinavian settlement. And that's a bit of a mouthful, but that's the simplest I can take it to explain how we should approach it. And so a lot of my discussions online are about trying to make that simple point that different scholars will have a different emphasis, but almost every scholar will start with that term, you'll use that term, but then rapidly explain why we have to use it in a precise way and not in a misleading or old-fashioned way.
Oh, I understand now. It's this is very interesting because I think we need in some point to find a complement for informations to try to explain what this is period, and not trying to only put terms to close this is this and this is that in the Viking Age.
Yes,
It's an open dialogue with many
absolutely.
aspects of the Viking Age, and this is a very great point about that.
And then you get started and you get into the fact that you can start to explain to people that the 9th century was very different from the 11th century, that what we call Viking in the North Atlantic settlement or the North settlement of the Faroes, of Iceland, of Greenland, and very briefly Lonsa Meadows, showing us some brief presence in the Americas. And very different from what's happening with the Kievan Rus, and very different from what's happening in England, in Ireland, that there's lots of things going on. And yes, there are shared connections. There's some language and some stories, and there's some origin myths that people in the Viking Age were making for themselves. Of course, there's a broader connections, but there was no single Viking culture or no single Viking way of life. It refers to a real mess of different ways of living and interacting with other peoples. And yeah, so I've been very much interested in Wales and England and Scandinavia, where I've done field work to try and look at those variations.
Oh, that's interesting. We can say that when we talk about populations that was before the Viking Age, example, the Anglo-Saxons, are the same way to research for the Viking Age example. We can say that we are putting the terms for like Anglo-Saxons to define a thing that they are not using in some point,
No.
or it's totally different. They
Yeah.
have these expressions for themselves, or it's different. How we can say about this?
Well, I mean, from the historical sources, we do have terms like we know that the Danes were being referred to as Danes quite early. We have evidence that the Angles were being called the Angles, but a lot of the terms we use are, and the Saxons, the terms of the Saxones from Latin sources. We know that probably almost everyone raiding in the North Sea from the 3rd, 4th century was called Saxons as a default term because people didn't know who they were. And we have other terms for peoples from the early Middle Ages used by writers. But most of these terms are our constructions, our sort of simplifications of messy processes. So if you had a group of Viking raiders from the 11th century, you'd probably find that some of them were speaking, well, probably they're multilingual. Some of them would have been from Slavic territories. Some of them would have been from northern Norway. Some of them would have been Frisian. Some of them would have been Saxons. Others would have been perhaps maybe even Pict. My point is that this was a world where people were moving around and languages were interacting, cultures are interacting. And so it's a messy world. Yes, it's not easy to simplify. And that's true of our world too. So at one level, we're quite well equipped to realize that, like today, in some ways, the world is about hybridity and creolization of the exchange of ideas and peoples. The fact we're speaking in English, and I appreciate you not expecting me to speak in Portuguese, which would go very wrong very quickly. But the fact we're having an English language conversation is a much bigger colonial phenomenon, but it does reflect that on the Viking Age, in the sense that in the Viking Age there was a lot of interactions of people and ideas, religions and cultures.
Oh, that's very, very, very nice to know that. And so we have these terms that are using just to that night for our, how can I say, our present to present this past. And that's very interesting to comprehend, because sometimes we think that these terms are using in that past, but it's conventions for now that we use. And you propose the Viking public research. And what is this meaning to use this type of research? It's research that persons using types of, how can I say, academics terms to combine with the actual terms. How you can say about this thing that you propose in your research?
Yeah, I suppose my point is there's already been a lot of work in the heritage sector and museums about how we tell stories, museology, heritage studies, and we have a big field of medievalism, a study of medieval reception, how the Middle Ages is received in today's world. And part of that is what we call Vikingisms, the reception of Viking tropes, ideas in popular culture today. But I suppose what I'm trying to suggest is that there tends to be scholars who look at a particular genre today, say maybe TV shows or films or metal or other kinds of rock music, or they look at art and they think of the reception of that little area. They think about that, or we focus on the academic focus, how do museums tell this story? How do we present the past? And I think that those are really important areas of research where there's, over the last 20, 30 years, been a range of good work. But I think we need to draw it all together. We need to globally realize that there should be a dedicated field of study that looks at how the Viking period is being used today in popular culture, from politicians talking about characterizing their enemies as barbarians. And we see that in current conflict zones around the world, where the Dark Ages and the barbarian trope, they don't say Vikings, but they are referring to various stereotypes of early medieval nomadic peoples, seafaring peoples, to denigrate their enemies. We see some of our leading politicians around the world doing that, particularly in the global north. We see it in Palestine, Israel. We see it in Ukraine, Russia. We see it in America. We see it even in Britain. We have conversations about threats from seaborne raiders. We see modern refugees and asylum seekers being treated as if they are invading across the seas in small boats equivalent to Viking raiders. Those parallels are being made, whether we like it or not. And now we've got this, discussion about the fate of Greenland, in which America and Denmark are finding themselves at loggerheads. And the Vikings are in the background of all of those conversations being used and misused. And we also see it in our popular culture too, where the Vikings are in our films and our TV shows. And some of those TV shows and films actually are really good and interesting, but they bring those narratives to the and problems with them. And so I think we as academics need to realize that while there are some, perhaps dangerous and misleading concepts and ideas in popular circulation that we call pseudo-archaeology or pseudoscience to do with ancient aliens, fictional ideas about ancient civilizations that lived in the last ice age, most of our real pernicious misinformation and disinformation circulated in our society is about ancient Rome, what happened after Rome, and particularly the Vikings. So whether we like it or not, this is a field that is really at the height of our global conversations, our global political discourses and popular culture. And we need to do research to evaluate that, rather than simply see it all as bad or see it all as a problem. Yes, a lot of it, sometimes it is, but sometimes it can be really important ways we can start conversations with people to get them interested in what we actually know and what we actually try to understand about the human past and its significance today. So for me, we need that a more dedicated research focus that recognizes the complex connections between past and present. My point is that we need funding, support, and energies and attention from many different disciplines, from language experts, from literature experts, to those that specialize in history and archaeology, film studies, media studies, all sharing an attention on how the Vikings are being used in our contemporary world.
Oh, yes, this is a point that is fantastic, because I saw in your research that have some aspects that you participate some medieval festivals, Viking Age festivals,
Yes.
and we see this presence of the traditions of new perceptions of Viking Age, but we have some points that we trying to get some academics to explain about the Viking Age and have a conversation that was fantastic to show this.
Well, in many ways, many enthusiasts and reenactors are ahead of us in not only the public education, but also in being responsible and challenging misinformation. And so actually I think academics are a little bit behind. We're not we've been in many ways responsible for a lot of these bad takes and these misinformation, and even recent scholarship has been responsible for rapidly leading to online misinformation and disinformation. So actually I think when I've been I haven't been to many, but when I've been to Viking festivals, and I was recently at the Jorvik Viking Festival in for the first time, where I contributed actually to I was invited over to do a seminar by a tattooist who is does Nordic style tattooing, and he invited me to speak, and I got into lots of conversations with non-academics, but who are really interested in what we know about the Viking Age. And my point is that they're the places where we can have some really good conversations with people who may not be academics, but they've certainly immersed themselves in the evidence and they're really keen to have those conversations. Whereas actually I find that sometimes academics can be some of the ones who are spreading old ideas and some bad information. So I think it's not for me as a university-based academic to tell everyone else how they are wrong. It's more about realizing that we need a much more close-knit conversation with different disciplines and with non-avocational, or what do you want to call amateur or enthusiasts. Together we can really do some important new research and combat some misinformation in a way we can't do by sitting producing glossy books or just peer-reviewed articles that only a few people read. So I think it's about trying to break down some barriers and try to recognize that academia is as much part of the problem and we need to be part of the solution.
Yeah, it's very just because sometimes I think we have these doubt that in some point we have afraid of commit some mistakes because of have an academic thinking to doing
yeah.
the things, and we have this part that we use the Viking age just for how can I say, for reenactor, for some expressions to complement this part, but and sometimes how can I say, have this conflict with the two parts, but I think they one complement the other, and it's very necessary
Yes.
to have the two parts in conversation.
And as an academic, I always make mistakes. I'm constantly making mistakes. The fact is, it's not about making the mistakes that's the problem. It's about learning from them and building on our errors and refining our understandings. And that's what we all need to be trying to do, rather than being fearful of getting something slightly wrong. And whether it's in I look back at my academic publications, which went through peer review and are rigorously and analysed. But I'm an archaeologist. I don't have an expert knowledge of, say, the folklore of Scandinavia, or other experts that you've had on your channel looking at the rune stones, or on settlement archaeology or material culture from different parts of the Viking world. We've all got our expertise, and we'll occasionally make errors. And it's about then reflecting on what do I do next time I'm doing a piece of research? How do we rectify that misunderstanding? And I think that's true of everyone, whether they're just in an online community talking about a particular topic, or they're in a faith-based spiritual group, or interested in Norse heathenry, whatever it may be. We've all got to sort of keep the conversation open, rather than believe a few people that we put on pedestals and claim know all the answers. I think that's really just a healthy way to proceed with anything.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And Professor, in our second part of our interview, we enter now in some point that in, how can I say, in our lives, this topic was sometimes it's polemic because people are afraid with that, but is about the death and the deaths in the Viking Age.
Yes.
And death is, I think it was one of the topics that was people sometimes, it's part of many societies, but sometimes it's a thing that we are scared in some point. It seems that one day we will die, but in the Viking Age, how we can think this topic, the death, what is the death for the Viking Age and the Viking societies? What is we can say about that for that period?
Thank you. I will answer your question, but first I want to reflect on the way you introduced it, because I think that's really important. Is that for me, I am interested in what happened in the Viking Age, but for me, one of the most important things about the Vikings is perhaps after ancient Egypt, which is a term that encapsulates thousands of years of change, but in simple popular terms, pre-Islamic Egypt, the thousands of years from the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, that is perhaps the most popular society of the past that people think about when they think about death outside of modern times. They think of ancient Egypt, mummies, pyramids, tombs, right? After that, I think the next, probably the most popular known about ancient time when death ritual were important, death rituals were significant, is the Viking Age, because we have mythological sources, we have legendary sources, we have written sources from the time, and the Ahmad ibn Fadlan's account, and we have, since the 19th century, an increasing number of excavations that have revealed Viking burial ritual. And for me, this is important. So I'm not answering your question yet, but I wanted to address the way you introduced it, because I think it's really important. This time period and this topic is really important for how people approach death today. And therefore, I think yes, we learn a lot through these graves about past times, but we also, I think it's really important for young people people of all backgrounds and cultures and ethnicities to talk about death at a time when it's obviously it's scary for everyone. It's a topic where people find it very uncomfortable to talk about. And if this is a way, if this is just one way we can have those conversations, that is something positive. In it, that's an end, that's a goal, that's a win, that's a positive thing. So, but answering your question, yeah, so we have a really rich range of evidence now of the Viking Age, and we can see not only very localized traditions across Scandinavia, and then when Scandinavian peoples are settling and interacting elsewhere, across the island in Britain, the Isle of Man, the North Atlantic in the west, areas of the Baltic coast, and areas of what are now Russia and Ukraine, we have evidence of these funerary rituals, and there's incredible variation. We have cremation rituals, we have inhumation practices, we have evidence that, well, we have some evidence that some people may have not got burial at all and may have just been exposed or disposed of in water. We may have a range of different ways of types of evidence. Burials that are of different wealth and rich. Some people had no objects at all buried with them. Some people had lavish graves, chamber graves, ship burial, ship cremation. There's more evidence of ships being burned on land than being buried. And so when we're dealing with that, we can link it up to some of these later sources and think about maybe some of these were motivated by beliefs in particular deities, particular afterlife destinations. But a lot of it we can't pin down. And I think the really cool thing about Viking death ritual is that it's incredibly variable. And also in the later Viking Age, we can see the transition to Christianity was also messy and partial, and that people were perhaps Christian missionaries, probably one of the last things they cared about was how people were buried. And so we have evidence of quite late in parts of the Scandinavian world, such as Gotland, of pagan and Christian burial sites in use and overlapping, and perhaps for a century, these traditions, interacting, and same in the West and the North Atlantic, in Iceland, we see evidence of a sort of yes, Christianity changes death ritual, but not overnight. And so we have this transition period of move to churchyard burial to unfurnished burial associated with those Christian traditions. And so for me, what's really cool about the Viking Age is we get this window into not necessarily what people thought, but what they felt, how they practically dealt with the dead in very different circumstances for people of different social status and for people of different backgrounds. And I suppose that's what's really great about studying this period. And I've been looking at it from a number of perspectives, and I've contributed some ideas and some approaches to how we decode that evidence, which are different from other scholars. And I've particularly looked at the idea of citation as a theme that we can pursue in understanding not the individual burials, but how burials related to each other. And that's been an idea that's been picked up by some other scholars, such as Leszek Gadewa, who's an expert on particularly the Polish Vikings and Viking Scandinavia too, and he's applied that idea to some of his data, and about how we look at burial sites and the relationship between graves being probably just as important as how individuals are treated. And we can see sort of how traditions build up by people, in the past having conversations with other graves. They're thinking about how they deal with the dead person that is in front of them and they're honoring, but they're referencing their ancestors. And another theme I've been looking at is I did some work excavating a Viking boat grave in southern Sweden, and sort of revealing a whole new Viking boat grave cemetery that had previously not been fully confirmed as a boat grave cemetery. And I've done some field work, and I've also been looking at Viking Age stone sculpture at hogback stones and how we interpret the Christian Vikings, if you like, or people who are of Scandinavian descent, but also them interacting with Christian ideas of death, and how we can interpret those types of monuments too. So that's the kind of things that I've been trying to look at and try to dig up and think through the different evidence we have.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. So we have many parts of funerals, and we saw that is some movies and series try to bring us this perspective of death. We saw some rituals using long ships, and example in the 13 Warrior, or
Yes.
in this fantastic movie, we saw the Lagertha funeral in the series Vikings.
Oh,
That
that
was,
was amazing, wasn't it?
yeah, it's when we saw that, we think, oh, this is amazing. They use all these structures to do this funeral, is brilliant. But what it is reality, and this is fictionary thing about the death in the Viking Age and the process of funeral rituals. What do
Yeah,
you
I mean,
say about
what I
that?
think, my take, and obviously people disagree on how we interpret this. It's very difficult to interpret. There's no easy solution. We see these wonderful artist reconstructions of graves, and when you look at the real evidence, you realize how fragmentary it is. Even the really rich graves, there's many different ways you can interpret that evidence. But the way I start off is say that a lot of those TV and film funerals are so right and yet so wrong at the same time. One of the things I think they get right is as Professor Neil Price has talked about a lot, is the theatre, the spectacle, and the performance of the funeral as public events involving people, animals, resources, particularly for high status funerals. These were meant to be elaborate and alluding to myth and story. They were actually creating myth and story. And I think Neil's work in that area is really important for thinking about those aristocratic funerals, and those that the evidence we have reveals that theatrical nature of funerals. These were events that were supposed to be remembered for a generation. And in that sense, I think those TV shows and funerals, I think, are really helpful for us, because they show to wider audiences those very ideas that Professor Andres Andren and Professor Martin Carver, and more recently Professor Neil Price, have developed. Those ideas of how the pre-Christian elite funerals of Scandinavia and elsewhere are open air public theatre that are about honouring the dead person and saying goodbye to them, but also about consolidating the power and identities of those left behind. They're about the living. They're about how the living articulate their claims to land, their claims to resources and social position. So you're honouring the dead to ensure that you, as the living, can access their land, their power, their resources, probably at a time of social crisis when someone very important has died. Those funerals are never about honouring a personality. They're about political theatre as well as being spiritual religious moments, and the political and the religious aspects of those funerals is really important. Where I think the TV shows go wrong, or at least I don't think the TV shows get it wrong, I think many people watching them get it wrong, is the idea that these were excuse me,
No
these were
problem.
these were time hallowed traditions, that people had a really clear idea of what they were doing. And if anything, I think even if you mentioned the I think it was season 5 of Vikings, the TV show, where you have the funeral of the much loved character Lagertha, and obviously the TV show's representation of that takes ideas from the archaeology and just goes crazy. It just goes, everything's up to 11, to use a Spinal Tap word. Everything's turned up to hyper. It's on ice, and there's huge ballista bolts breaking the ice, and it's taken to crazy extremes. And obviously that's not based on anything we have evidence for from the Viking Age. But where I think it's correct is that it shows that that was a funeral that was unlike any other they'd ever done before or would ever do again. And I think the TV show got that right, that when we look at one of these funerals like the Oseberg ship or the Gokstad ship or the Lardby ship burial, these really elaborate funerals, I don't think those attending those funerals would have seen anything like it before, and would probably never in their lifetime see another one. That these are supposed to be exceptional, elaborate funerals that would be remembered and people would talk about, that people traveling would go, I saw the funeral and this is what happened and this is how they honored their king or their queen or their chieftain or their jarl. Or, these were intended to be exceptional, remembered events, like royal funerals in parts of Europe today. Even though our royalty are largely politically powerless, their funerals are still theatre where politicians and society still try to make sense of themselves. And so when we see the funeral, the death of Diana, the Princess of Wales, and then we see the death of the Queen Mother and then Queen Elizabeth in Britain, in the UK, we know these individuals are incredibly wealthy, almost like modern day celebrities. They're not powerful anymore. But imagine if they were, and they are you're in the Viking Age, their deaths affect everyone, whether you like them or not, whether you benefited from them or not. That your life was tied to those personalities and their death mattered and would be remembered. So their funerals were always experiments and were perhaps intended to be memorable. I just need to guzzle some tea. Us British live off tea. So we have I think that's the way I like to approach them, that these TV shows like the 13th Warrior film takes its ideas from the 10th century source by Ahmad ibn Fadlan. I don't think that funeral was typical of anyone in that period. I think it was intended to be memorable, a spectacle, and perhaps only one per generation was ever performed in that way. And I think when we dig up the archaeology, we have to think about it in that way, not this is the way they died like a Viking and that everyone at the time would have known what was going on. I think they were intended to be crazy, elaborate, almost over the top funerals in their day that were memorable because they were so extravagant. Where they were killing dogs, they were killing horses, they were strangling chickens, they were sacrificing people sometimes, and they were, soaking up vast amounts of food, drink, sexual excess, violence. They were intended to be bloody, messy, horrible, memorable events. And I think that is something we kind of forget when we try to make them a little bit too modern and Victorian and everyone's standing there going very serious and we shall honor him like a Viking. I don't think they were doing that. I think they were trying to make exceptional moments to be remembered. So I think that's my way I approach those really wealthy aristocratic burials. And we can see in the archaeology that most of the burials aren't like that. Most burials are much simpler and less complex. They still would have been important events, but they were not the same level of extravagance. And I think that's what our archaeological evidence shows quite clearly.
Oh, that's very dirty. So we can say that the death was seen as a ritual of performance, yes, for that period. And, I think so. And we can say that some aspects of the sacrifice are associated in this process of the funerals. We have sometimes the aspects in the tapestry of Uzbek example. We have the hanged tree, that was the persons that are hanged in a tree. And probably this is part of real rituals that are a performance. Odin was a god associated with the hanged person, and he suffered the hanged to obtain the runes. In some perspectives in the literature, that not was in the Viking, but have some relation to this. And what we can say about this aspect in the process of the rituals, funeral rituals, I can say the sacrifice are part of the process of, in some point, not only just a sacrifice, but an interpretation of, in some point, of something that will remind us the Norse mythology, remind us the life of the persons that was, in some point, are honored in the process. How we can say, we have many types. We have sacrifice of children, women's, men's, in many aspects. How we can say about that?
It's a really difficult area and not something I've ever published on myself. But I mean, my response would be I think the way we think about it, and this is very much following Neil's work, is the idea that my kind of response is that you kind of there's many aspects of the funerary rituals we can't dig up and we can't reconstruct, but we have to imagine that they are in different parts of Scandinavia and the Viking diaspora. They have these stories, but these stories aren't fixed, and they're using them in very different scenarios. So when maybe they are occasionally unaliving people as part of their death rituals, be they slaves or captured prisoners or other people they simply didn't like the look of and they're never popular anyway. Who knows? My point is, when they were doing that, I suspect they were drawing on this mythology and creating this mythology. So rather than a fixed set of canon ideas, they were drawing on those concepts of death as a sacrifice for gaining wisdom and other such concepts that we find in those later sources. So I don't know how we get much further than that. I'm a little sketchy, other than there has been a renewed series of publications on human sacrifice in the Viking world, in which Kevin Walsh and Marianne Moen and others have been working on this issue. And so I would defer to their expertise, because they're the most recent scholars who have addressed this issue. But I think we have to understand it as not one fixed understanding of human sacrifice. But I think we can't deny that human sacrifice would have been a part of these elaborate rituals. I don't think we can just explain away, oh no, they were nice people. No one does that. I'm sorry, in many different cultures this type of thing does go on in different scales. I'm not saying it was commonplace, but it was a feature, and I think we have to admit that the sources are revealing that. And some of the archaeological evidence from burials, it can be to some degree support that view, but I'm not a complete expert on that field. I would just but I know there's some recent publications on that, so I think it's an ongoing area of discussion.
Yeah, and we saw that have some changes in this process of try to do these burials. And we can say that, saw that in example, Sotanu is considered in some points the last of his type of funeral. And these have some change to that period, to the Viking Age. And what we can say or saw about this process of changing, and what it is changing is explain to us what this society tried to how can I say, express with that. This changing is for some reason have some aspect that we can say why do this example or not. It's just changing because it's not necessary from that period, but it's a thing that they only think, no, we're gonna change doing this, that, for complement something that we are trying to tell us.
So I mean, when we see it depends on which region you're talking about in the Viking world, but if I can crudely just talk about, say, parts of northern England where we received Scandinavian settlements in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, and we're thinking about the fact we've got a very clear phase of furnished burial, which shows not necessarily everyone who was buried that way was from Scandinavia. Some of them may have been long-term settlers in Ireland or the Outer Hebrides before settling in these parts of England in the very end of the 9th century into the early 10th century, in the Danelaw, in around the Irish Sea, Cumbria. We have these furnished burials, such as we have the Cumwhitten burial group from Cumbria that was found by metal detectorists. When we see those burials, and those on the Isle of Man, for example, and those associated with Viking Dublin, we have to look at a society where the gravesite is a focus of theatre, as we said, but also competition and expression of identity. And very rapidly, however, when Christianity is being adopted, those people are not abandoning everything about their faith overnight, but what they are realizing is that Christianity gives them whole new strategies and materials with which to express those same ideas. So the Christian world wasn't as different as people would make out for these Scandinavians. And they realized that burial location and investment in above ground monuments may have been a much more important medium for securing their identity and their competition between elites than the furnished burial traditions that they had inherited. So it's not necessarily about they converted faith as much as they realized there were better advantages to using the church and its resources and its burial space as a place where you honor your dead, because that gives you a new, more secure and more permanent place to invest your wealth in, to access status and power and claims to land and resources. So it's kind of what we often gloss as Christian conversion in terms of burial is actually about the people themselves finding a better way to access power and identities in death. And I think that's an important point that people can misunderstand and think that every time we see the abandonment of furnished burial traditions as people having their culture robbed from them or Christianity imposed on them. Yeah, sure, that happened in the early Middle Ages, as it happened later in the colonial era. But a lot of in the Scandinavian world, a lot of this was their own choices to make best use of their the funerals as an environment to show off your status and identity. And I think that's why we see the shift to churchyard burial happening so rapidly. And the investment in the later 10th and 11th centuries is in the church and in stone sculpture associated with those churches, because that's where you can, as landed elites, whether you're fully of Scandinavian origin or you're have ancestry that's mixed between the local native people and Scandinavians, this is the way you can, establish your power base and continue your authority and claims to resources and inheritance. So I think and we see that happening in Scandinavia too in the late Viking Age with the runestone tradition. I think this is very much, at least my understanding of it, is it's less about Christian conversion and more about shifting socio-politics and land claims, and that you're looking at new ways people are using material culture to claim those links to place and inheritance. So for me, a lot of what we see in the Viking Age is called Christian conversion, is actually about various socio-political strategizings by the local people themselves.
Oh, and we can say that the Vikings going to England changes many aspects of the form of doing these burials and funerals rituals. What we can say that when they doing their settlements in this area, what we can say that about this funeral, they continue some process of the Scandinavian life, or they doing things that are more closer to the English persons doing in that time?
Well, I suppose there's lots to say there, but again, trying to keep it very simple, and straightforward. I think we see the Scandinavians are coming from different parts of Scandinavia, so we're dealing with different groups of Scandinavians interacting with an island or islands with many different groups of people already. So it's not with the Anglo-Saxons is a gloss for many different Germanic speaking peoples. They're encountering the Picts, who are Brythonic speakers. They're encountering the Old Welsh, or the Britons, who are a mixture of Welsh, Cornish and Cumbrians and Strathclyde Britons, and they're encountering the Gaels they're encountering Gaelic speaking Scots. So they're encountering different peoples, and it's at that local context that we can see the adaptions. And yes, they are being changed, and they are changing the society. So the new societies and new kingdoms that emerge in the 10th century and 11th century, of which one is England and one is Scotland, these nations come out of that Viking world, are a hybrid of Scandinavian influence and mixing with these other groups. So yeah, they are changing Britain, and Britain is changing them. So it's not one or the other.
Oh, that's a very good point to see like that. So we have some these aspects that are bringing two cultures, but they are in some point found together because of these aspects of Christianity and the paganism are in the same place, in the same and this is a very interesting point.
And I think it's in the carved stone monuments that we have in northern England, you can see that blending of story. One of the things they inherit, I mean, yes, a language and dialect, I mean, does persist, and people with of the Scandinavian dialects of Scandinavian language affects the dialects of Northern England, for example, right the way down to the modern era. But also, that's outside of my field of research, but that's what language scholars tell me. But also, we have to think about the whether they stayed pagan or not, and they may not have stayed pagan more than a couple of generations. They certainly kept their stories, and it's on the stones, the carved stones, where we see the story of Sigurd the dragon slayer, the story of Volander the smith, who would have already been a known personality. The story of Wayland, we know, was already a character in Anglo-Saxon Christian culture. So they were able to find common ground and individuals and narratives that could be shared between these different hybrid communities. And it's on those carved stones that we see that blending of Scandinavian and various different local storytelling. And so I think it's people look at those stones and say, oh, they're Viking, they're Norse myths on the stones. They're not really. They are already showing that mixture of Christian, of Latin, of Anglo-Saxon, of Scandinavian ideas blending together. And I think that's what's really cool about the stonework that I've also been looking at, including the hogback stones.
Oh, this is our next part of this interview. That was very interesting that you say about the hogbacks, is because you study about some how can I say, not only the hogbacks, but some monuments related to the death and related to not only say, but not mythology, because these some monuments like some crosses and some hogbacks have elements of two different cultures. And
Yes.
what you can say about for the first we start about that, what is an hogback? What is this element that us show us very good in art representing there, but we saw aspects of Norse mythology, we saw aspects with the Christian culture. What is the is element, and so important to analyze the thing of the process of the death in the Viking Age?
Yeah, so the hogback is one of those rubbish terms that archaeologists and art historians use that comes from a 19th century term. And the reason they were originally called hogbacks is they've got a bowed roof, and they apparently that looks like the back of a pig, and that's why they're called hogbacks. It's really unhelpful as a term. The best way to describe them really are recumbent stones. In other words, they're low grave covers, and they are shaped like a house with a roof-like structure carved in stone. And occasionally, actually often, they have end beasts at either end are grabbing them, and most often these are definitely bears. So they have two bears that grip this roof structure. And we find the most classic examples of these in North Yorkshire, but we also have them in other parts of Northern England and southern and central Scotland. And there are also monuments elsewhere in the island of Britain, as far north as Shetland and Orkney, and as far south as Cornwall, and as far west as Southwest Wales, that have, by different scholars, been called hogbacks. But the biggest focus of them is east of the Pennines and just west of the Pennines in Lancashire and Cheshire, but mostly in North Yorkshire, in areas where we know in the 10th century there was heavy Scandinavian settlement, of Hiberno-Norse settlement. So these are stone carved grave covers that have tended to be dated to the 10th or early 11th century and are associated with areas that had heavy Scandinavian settlement, Hiberno-Norse and Danish settlement. And because of that, they tend to be seen as Viking, although in almost every scholar now would admit that's really tenuous, because there's already a well-established tradition throughout the Mediterranean, throughout Western Europe, in the Christian world, of commemorating saints and special individuals, high status individuals, under canopied roofs. They're reliquaries, they're like shrines, they're tomb shrines. And so And what it looks like is that in the Viking Age, this mixture of Scandinavians, Britons, and Anglo-Saxons are drawing on that Christian tradition and are commemorating their dead, their high status dead, the wealthy farmers and landowners in this area that sees political dislocation. You know, there's no centralized power in this sort of middle Britain, from the kingdom of Strathclyde south to the kingdom of York. It's much more broken up. The England isn't fully England yet. Scotland isn't fully Scotland yet. It's a messy world. And in that mix, local power bases, they're using this medium of Christian carved stonework to commemorate their dead, and they're using these low, sort of end beast shrine tombs as a medium of commemorating their dead. So we call them Viking monuments or Viking colonial monuments, but really what we're talking about is these hybrid communities I was speaking about before, experimenting with new ways of commemorating the dead in tombs. And why they're so cool is that sometimes the side panels have these really amazing scenes, some of which seem to allude to later recorded Norse mythology, others to a mixture of Norse mythology and Christian scenes. And the bears themselves, some people have said, well, they're Scandinavian because they're bears, but throughout Britain as well, bears, whether there's a debate about when exactly bears go extinct, but certainly bears as symbols, as Christian symbols of resurrection, because there's a Christian myth that bears lick their young into life, that they give the birth to cubs dead and they lick them into life. This is a Christian mythology. This idea of them bears hibernating linked to ideas of resurrection, linked to the warrior associations of bears, linked to the perhaps even ideas of shape-shifting and taking on ursine identities. All of these ideas may have come together to make bears a powerful symbol of elite power. So these tombs are really cool, and there's been so many different interpretations of them. And I suppose the way I've approached them is to say, well, we don't know exactly the names of the people who commissioned them and raised them. We're not even finding them in their original context because they're often been dislocated and reused in later church building. So we don't have any over graves. But what we can say about them is that they are probably arguments in stone, to use a phrase of Professor Martin Carver. They're trying to make sort of a rich language of commemoration, very much like the furnished boat graves we were talking about before, but in a different medium. They're trying to make really powerful theatre in stone. And I one of the ideas I've played with is the idea that these hogbacks are trying to create almost like solid spaces. They're protecting the grave by putting a massive great stone over them, but giving you that illusion you can access it, just like a saint's tomb was a focus of pilgrimage where you believed you could access the presence of the saint. Perhaps they were trying to do that in a secular context too, give this sense that the dead are there and powerful and are watching over and dominating the affairs of the living. So I think they're very much really rich symbolic material culture that we can't read them exactly anymore, but I think they were about protecting the dead and commemorating the dead as a powerful force amongst the living. So that's the way I've kind of interpreted them. And I've done some published papers about the hogback at West Kirby on the Wirral Peninsula. And I really think they're just a fascinating relic of the Viking Age in Britain.
I think hogbacks was one of the most mysterious but beautiful, I think, monuments in the England to comprehend this process, because
yes,
in some point some researchers don't find bodies, how can I say, burials that they serve like how can I say, explain to you? They don't find bodies inside of this in Earth, and the hogback is in the part of to cover the body, but we can say that they serve to mark a tomb or some aspects of of a person that are deadly, because they didn't find bodies in the parts of the hogbacks are put in aspects place.
I mean, to be honest with you, almost all early, almost every early medieval piece of carved stone monument is not in its original place. If they weren't dislocated in the Viking Age, the Norman regime took over, and the local Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Danish elite were wiped out in terms of dislocated from their land. So their monuments probably went too. And if they didn't go in the 12th century or the late 11th, 12th century, they would have gone by the 15th, 16th century as churches are built and rebuilt. So we've lost any original grave. There is one hogback which is over a grave, but that's not from Northern England. That's one of the ones from Winchester. And so we know that we can make the inference. And also from Heysham and Lancashire, there's an antiquarian account that says they found a grave with a body associated with the hogback. But we can't really believe that because it's from a very early source. I think the most likely assumption is they were tomb covers. So they were covering graves. But you're right. We don't know exactly how and how many of them were originally over graves, but they are from churches where there were churchyards from that period. People were burying the dead there, so I think it'd be difficult to argue if they were anything else other than grave covers of tomb covers. It's just we don't have the surviving archaeological evidence because these places remain places of worship and burial for another 1,000 years right up to the present day. So any original association has sadly long gone.
Oh, that's interesting because we don't have so much aspects of they are burial lit, and it's different because we can say that the monuments representing aspects of the traditions of, and many of that are not made necessary probably with aspects with the Viking Age aspects. We have some example the hogback in the Saint's Tomb that was in the Gosforth Church, are a hogback that we can say that have aspects of Christianity with aspects of mythology, but not necessarily that they are from a period that was in fact in the Viking Age. We have some interpretation that probably was Sigurd, was Thor, that was representing fighting with the serpent. Well, we have many aspects that divide us. What we can say about these monuments that was found in the Gosforth Church? We saw that they have the Gosforth cross.
Yes.
We have these hogbacks. But what exactly are occurred there in the church? What is?
Oh, Gosforth is such an amazing site. I don't know if you've had a chance to go to Cumbria at all, but if anyone has an opportunity, I haven't been there for many years. I need to make another visit because, yes, you've got this exceptionally tall cross which has scenes that are, a Christian cross, yet with scenes of Ragnarok on the cross. And then you have two hogback stones, which are really cool in themselves. They're really special. And one of them, as you say, has Christ clearly crucified on either end, and yet scenes that may show Thor fighting Jormungandr. You have these scenes that could be from Norse mythology too. So Gosforth is on the far west coast of Cumbria. It's part of that Irish Sea zone where Celtic-speaking, Germanic-speaking peoples and the Norse-speaking peoples are interacting in this 10th, early 11th century period. And so I think it's a wonderful, so it captures the sort of hybridity we were talking about before of belief and commemoration and people. Now, we can't reconstruct in absolute confidence who raised these monuments and over whose grave. We wish we had those names and those details, but I think what I think it shows is, I have to just repeat myself, Gosforth is a brilliant example that sort of shows that just a handful of monuments, and there must have been more that we've lost, because that church is full of other fragments of stones, some of which could be hogbacks, others could be crosses. this is just part of a story that we have survived, that shows us this 10th, early 11th century world, and the rich ideas shared around the Irish Sea zone, or the coasts of Eastern Ireland, the Isle of Man, southwest Scotland, Dumfries and Galloway, Cumbria, Lancashire, and North Wales as well. So I think we can't be precise, but it just shows that mixture of ideas, and that people were very confident in putting a what we would call a pagan story, but a story that comes from Scandinavian, the end of the world, in juxtaposition with the Christian faith.
Oh, it's very interesting. So we have many monuments that are related to death, and some aspects of funeral, but
Yeah.
aspects with the mixtures of religions, and that's very interesting. And what we can consider the most importance of all these moments, we can say that have someone that we can say that, oh, this very important to analyze, and we don't need to forget this, because we can have answers for many aspects. Analyze this type of monument. We have many other monuments, not only necessary hogbacks, crosses,
Mm.
or others that represent the some that mark parts of burials in
Mm.
that period.
And I think we're finding new evidence all the time. And that's the thing that people need to be aware of, is that while we're still reliant on sites like Gosforth, which are long known about, archaeologists are producing new evidence across the Viking world, from England to Ireland, Scandinavia, Iceland, which is refining our understanding. So we have, for example, the work done by Oxford Archaeology North, who are a commercial unit, and other churches in Cumbria, which has produced even more stone sculpture, such as at Workington. And some of those fragments are in themselves just wonderful features of Viking period sculpture, and they're adding to our information. The burial site I talked about before at Cumwhitton has produced a small selection of furnished burials of the 10th century, which is the first sort of cemetery of its kind we've got. And the up in Scotland, the Arden and Merkham boat grave. These are all examples of new excavations that sort of build our picture of the Scandinavian presence in these islands. And so, yeah, we're always developing new understandings, and incrementally we're building our data set, because while I don't want to be dismissive of our written sources, we're not going to get, it's very unlikely, I wish we did, but I don't think it's very likely we'll get a massive trove of excavated documents, and therefore we rely on the written sources. Every metal detected find of a brooch, every new piece of stonework, every new burial is adding to that broader picture of this story. And so in 50 years time, I suspect people will be looking back, if this YouTube video survives, and rolling their eyes at all of the old-fashioned ideas I have. And I think that's only healthy. I want that to happen, because I don't want to be having to talk about the same ideas if we have better evidence that can tell us new things. So I hope that my ideas, and the ideas of my colleagues who are writing great material now, become very old-fashioned very quickly, because I and maybe some people will still look at our articles and books and go, yeah, this is a really good read, but they'll know that they're dated and that there's new evidence has augmented that information. And so I think in the next 50 years we're going to be seeing a very new kind of Viking age emerging as our research unfolds, and our new discoveries show us new aspects of life and death in the Viking world.
Well, that's a very, very interesting thing, because probably this interview will be discussed by all the students, and we saw that they will say, "Oh, but we know what happened now with this structure, with this burial, and this is a complement of many other things that we are talking here in the interview." And for my last question, I would like to know, it's a curiosity, but we have some differences, important difference from funerals for men's and women's for the Viking Age. And what this is, we can say that because we have Birka, probably was associated with woman, and she have weapons. And we saw that Lagertha was a shield maiden, and she have weapons too with her. But is exactly like some women have the same things that men's. You living from some place that they will go, example on hell or Valhalla, that men are chosen by the Odin warriors. And what is this aspect we can see the difference from these burials?
Are you specifically referring to the BJ581 discussion of a female warrior and
Yeah,
what we can? Yeah. So not only did we have the DNA work done on BJ581, which showed that the skeleton everyone assumed was a typical, a classic Viking warrior, is a biological female according to the DNA, and this led to a massive discussion in 2017, 18, 19 about what this tells us about the Viking world, and were there really shield maidens, and there's been other burials that have been subject to discussion, and as well as the work of Charlotte Hedjesterne Jonsson and her team. There's also been the work of Leisure Gadewa looking at other burials where women have either weapons and with a female gendered assemblage, but there's a weapon too, or there are biologically female estimated individuals who have a full weapon set. So there seems to be a spectrum of practices, and this has led to discussions of whether we're looking at are there individuals who lived as warriors, as in a masculine realm, but they were biologically female? Were there individuals who had some kind of third gender? Were there individuals who had some kind of ambiguous gender, which is that maybe shifted their identity? They were transgender in some sense in the Viking world, and this gets people very animated and excited. And I think that's at one level that's really good. The other challenge though is how do we interpret these sources, and a lot of it comes down to whether we think the grave is a reflection of how that individual lived their life, or is it a way in which they are honored for the next world. So and these are questions that are really difficult to unpick, and I think that for me you can simultaneously look at BJ581 and go, yes, warrior woman kicking ass, there, and then you can simultaneously go, no, it definitely wasn't a warrior woman, because they must have all given her those objects so that she was never going to do that thing. It was all about her male kin. And I sit in the kind of middle space there, because I think there's a number of unanswered questions here we need more research on. And I think it's a really healthy debate at one level, although it does attract some very toxic online behaviors of men who just can't cope with the idea that women did anything of importance in the Viking world. And it led to some really ugly sort of online conversation, shall we say. But I think on the whole, it shows we should never accept our preconceived ideas. I think in terms of the way the TV show represents Viking warrior women, I think that's in the realms of fantasy. But the idea that certain women could have taken up military roles, that certain women, well, perhaps in most women, would certainly have been able to wield axes and bows and spears, because they would have had to in various hunting and mercantile. Women were trading and raiding too. It doesn't mean they were necessarily in a shield wall operating as male warriors, but they were certainly part of those expeditions. So I think there's a lot of sort of polemic and silliness around these discussions, but there's a lot of really healthy debate too. So from my point of view, I think burials never reflect exactly how people were in life, but could there have been women who took on those roles? Absolutely. And certainly I think it helps us to really get to grips with what do we think we're seeing in these burials, and do we actually feel these are, could these be, as you say, being dressed for a stylized afterlife, where they are being Valkyries in some capacity, or they're going off to the Hall of Freya and Vestmannsnir, and they're going to the plains of or are they going to Valhalla? There's different options. So are they being dressed in different fashions for different ideals? So I don't know. But I'm just saying that it really is an exciting area for getting people thinking about what we're seeing in the burial evidence. But certainly it's not a bad thing that we have these conversations and we get people thinking about the meaning of things, because people in the past were probably having these conversations too. They were probably standing around the grave trying to make decisions about how that person should be honored appropriately, and in terms of what they did in their life, where they want them to go after life into the next world, and also the various different people who are contributing to that funeral. So I'm not giving you an easy answer because I don't have one, to be honest. But I think the BJ581 chamber grave has been a really important conversation about how we interpret our data. Sorry,
Fantastic.
that's a bit wishy-washy, but that's the best I can do.
No problem. It's fantastic your answer. I was very curious about that because it's a burial that gives us many challenges to analyze how women and men are in some point are different in the aspects of ritual funerals. And we saw that in aspects, example, in shamans, when I how can I say, they found bodies of shamans, they are using some dress, and this is a very different thing to analyze because in
Yeah.
some point we only have the image of a man that only use the men clothes, but men's using women's clothes is open the discussion of what this is, the use of what is giving us to how can I say, giving us an answer to what it is really considered masculine or feminine in that time. And this is a big challenge because they don't think like us in
No.
nowadays. They have totally different form of think and using
I
the
think one of the healthy starting points for studying any ancient culture is that the past was not like us, and our obsession with a very binary identity where you are either a man or a woman would have been a very unusual and rather strange thing, even in the warrior cultures and the overtly patriarchal societies of the Viking Age. And make no mistake, it wasn't a nice place to be a woman at all. Yes, there were more freedoms and people like to talk about some of those aspects, but it was still a very patriarchal world. But even in that kind of society, I think our modern obsession with being a man or a woman would have been seen as a bit weird, and our obsession with arguing about what makes a man and a woman, even in those cultures, I think would have been seen as a little uncomfortable and strange. And so I think in those societies they would have had a healthy recognition that people in different statuses and different roles had different identities, and there were, not everyone would have been a Lagertha, and not everyone would have been an Aslag, or to use those modern fictional characters, not everyone would have been a Rollo or a Ragnar, in terms of the TV show, and that there would have been a whole spectrum. And indeed, to be fair to the TV show, they do try to tackle that, and they do show that society was not a monolith of stylized characters, that these were supposed to be, they're talking about exceptional characters in their time, even in that fictional world. So I think it'd be good for us to remember that when we're trying to deal with the archaeological evidence.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And Professor, thank you so much for doing this interview. It was amazing have you here because I accompany your work. I love to saw your YouTube video channel. I saw your
Thank
blog.
you.
I love to read about because I have a passion with things like death and burials, funerals.
Yeah.
I like this part of history.
Oh, it's
And
fantastic.
do you have some, how can I say, some suggestions of books for the audience that you like to say, oh, this is interesting to read, this is interesting to
Oh,
search?
yes, I could do. I'll tell you. Can I do a shameless plug? I haven't actually got it with me. I can go and get if my brand new book out isn't all about the Vikings, but there's some really cool papers in it about Viking death ritual, and it's a co-edited collection. It's open access, so it's free to read, and it's from Sidestone Press, and it's edited by me and the Dutch researcher Femke Lippok, and it's called Cremation in the Early Middle Ages. And we have papers about pre-Viking and Viking Age death rituals in it, including papers on Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Poland, France, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, and Ireland and Britain. And so we've got different researchers looking at burning the dead and the different ways we interpret that. And that's open access, and it was out only a few months ago. And so I have to use this as an opportunity to plug that book, because I'm very proud of it, because we did it in a different way. We did it in this format. We recorded conversations with the academics who are doing the latest field work and analysis, including researchers on Viking death rituals, and so we actually transcribed and edited interviews. So hopefully it's quite easy to read. If you're not a first language English reader, you might find this quite easier to get into than perhaps more standard academic writing. And so I hope that it interests people. So the book's called Cremation in the Early Middle Ages.
Oh, perfect. I will only check this book, and I think the audience of the channel will be very interesting to read them and comprehend more this subject, because it's very interesting. And sometimes we forget to analyze them, but it's important because the Vikings are talking to us in form of that, and we saw and we saw things, we learn things with the bodies, and this is important study to analyze.
And as you say, whatever we learn about the past, it reflects on how we're dealing with our own mortality today. So whatever we think about women in the past and the BJ 581 burial, whatever we think about hogbacks or boat cremation in a boat, we are cremating our dead today. We are trying to think about material culture and how we honor our loved ones. And I think these distant times can be important mirrors for reflecting on our concerns.
Yeah, perfect. Professor, thank you so much again for doing this interview. It is an honor receiving you here. I will just stop the recording now. Okay.